speaker. So welcome to tonight's program.
Hi, everyone. I just want to let you know that next month's program is on November 4th, Thursday, and it'll be on the good and bad of GMOs. And I'll put a link in the chat for that. And then I'll introduce our speaker. We're very excited to have him here. His name is Andres Ortega, and he is an ecologist with the DuPage Forest Preserve Natural Resources Department. And he has a BS and MS in biology, both from Northern Illinois University. And as the district's invertebrate ecologist, he works to protect and restore beneficial insect populations in DuPage County and control those that are threats to human or environmental health. At home, he likes to share his love of insects with his two sons by searching for butterflies and dragonflies on hikes in the local nature preserves. And now I'll hand you over to Andres.
All right, thank you very much, Wendy, and good evening, everybody. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen and get the presentation up. So thank you again to Wendy and to Joe for the invitation to speak tonight. Hopefully everyone can see that, looks good. So again, my name is Andres Ortega. I'm the invertebrate ecologist with the Forest Preserve District of DuPage County. And it's a fairly interesting job title. It's not one we hear much. So the way I try and describe what I do at the district is any invertebrate, primarily insect-related program we have at the district is a program that I help oversee. More specifically, what I do is essentially two things. So within the district, I try and help protect or restore beneficial insect populations. But the other side of that coin is I spend a lot of time trying to eradicate or reduce harmful populations, things like invasive species or those that are like a public health risk, like mosquitoes. And so today we're going to be talking about two of my favorite ones to work with, which are the endangered insects of DuPage County. So to be very clear, when I say endangered insects, we're really talking about federally endangered. So what we mean by that is some animal or plant that has the highest level of legal protection here in the United States. And so in DuPage County, we have two federally endangered insects. The first is the rusty-patched bumblebee. And this is currently the only federally endangered bumblebee. And you see there, I underlined bumblebee. You hear a lot in the news about endangered bees or how bees are in decline. Oftentimes they're referencing honeybees, which are totally important. They're a very important species, especially for agriculture, but they're not native, so they're not one I work with very closely. Instead, I work with our native bumblebees much more frequently. And again, of those, the rusty-patched is the only federally endangered bumblebee species. And then the other species we'll be talking about is the Hine's emerald dragonfly, which is the only federally endangered dragonfly. So personally, I feel very lucky to work in DuPage County, where we have the only federally endangered bumblebee and the only federally endangered dragonfly, both existing here in the county. So first we'll start with rusty-patched bumblebee. And I always tell people, if you want to work with a species, endangered or not, be it monarch butterflies, be it orchids, be it any particular plant or animal, you need to know what you're looking at first, right? And so one of the most important things you need to learn beforehand is identification of that species. And so just take a quick look at these three photos. And, as I'm talking, kind of get an idea of which one you think might be rusty-patched bumblebee and kind of get an idea of why you thought, why you picked that particular choice. And then we'll just very briefly go through the identification of the species and how easy it is, frankly, to confuse it with other things. So when I first started working with rusty-patched bumblebee, I was completely convinced I was seeing it everywhere, right? I was looking around for it because I was aware that it was at that point going to be listed as a federally endangered species. So I'm like, all right, I'm going to go out and look for it. And I'm like, man, I don't know how these are rare. I'm finding them everywhere. And what I was really seeing was the photo on the left, which is not the rusty patch bumblebee. You can see it definitely has a patch of color on its abdomen, kind of that rusty reddish brown color, but that's not actually the rusty patch bumblebee, and I'll explain why in a moment. And then the one on the bottom is actually a honeybee. So that's not a bumblebee at all. And again, nothing against honeybees. They are critically important, especially for agriculture, but just not something I work closely with. And so the photo on the left is the rusty patch bumblebee. And you can see that it does have a very distinctive rusty, kind of reddish, orangish, sometimes it might appear brown patch. But there is one key feature about it that you have to pay attention to. And that is that the patch is completely surrounded by yellow hairs. So you see yellow hairs above, on the side, and below that patch. This fellow is a brown belted bumblebee. And so you can see it has yellow hairs on top, yellow hairs on the side, but on that bottom margin of the coloration, it directly touches the black hairs. So again, I don't expect anyone to be an expert after just a couple of photos. It's really just to highlight how important it is to learn identification when you want to work with any particular species you're working with. So why is rusty patch bumblebee endangered? There are a couple ways to answer that question. And one is looking at a range map of rusty patch bumblebee. So you can see the map here. And in this map, every county you see in kind of that grayish color is its former historical range. So everywhere that's kind of shaded in gray is where we had records of the bee up to about, say, 30 years ago or so. Where they exist now are the areas in red surrounded by yellow. And to be very clear, not the yellow. The red are the areas where we have current observations of rusty patch. The yellow are simply buffer zones where there's a good potential that they occur, but we haven't actually observed them yet. And so really, if you're focused on the red, you can see how incredibly small their range is compared to what it used to be. In fact, currently their range is about 0.1% of their former range. So an enormous decrease in their range. And even where they're still found, it's about an 80% decline in the population. So even where you find them, 20 years ago when you would have found 100 bees in an area, at this point, you would be lucky to find maybe 20 bees in that same area. So again, a very steep decline in range and population. And unfortunately, there's not just one reason why this has happened. There's not just like one smoking gun we can point to, right? It's a number of complex factors. And so it's going to be things like habitat loss. So what used to be a field of flowers is now an agricultural field or is an urban area. Or it could be habitat degradation. What used to be a field of flowers is now still a field, but is impacted by invasive species, invasive woody species like trees, things that the bees can't use. And of course, pesticide use plays a big part in it. So the overuse of pesticides, the misuse of pesticides, and certain types of pesticides are incredibly harmful, not just to rusty patch, but really to all bees and many other pollinators as well. And so all of those kind of combine into this perfect storm of negative impacts to the species. So when you want to help a species, when you want to help a species recover, you need to know where they are, what they're doing, and what they depend on at different times of the year. I always use monarchs as a really well-known example. If you want to help monarchs, you need to know that they migrate. And so where they are at different times of the year, they're overwintering in Mexico, or in the summer, they're in the US and Canada. You need to know what they depend on, right? You need to know that in the larval stage, they depend on milkweed, and later on, they depend on nectar flowers as adults. So let's take a little bit of a closer look at rusty patch bumblebee, see what we know about their life history, what they're doing at different times of the year, to start getting clues on how we can help the species. So starting in spring, early spring, very early actually, much earlier than almost any other bee species in our area. We're talking around late March to early April. You will have new queens that have been basically hibernating since fall of last year wake up and immediately want to start a colony. And that image you can see on the bottom is a rusty patch queen, and you can notice it doesn't really have that much rusty coloration. So again, just highlighting, how important identification can be, and sometimes different life stages can trick you up a bit. But in early spring, these new queens wake up and they want to start their colony. What that means is they haven't eaten for a few months, so they immediately need to start collecting nectar and pollen to be able to start producing eggs and start that colony. What this means is that they are dependent on very early spring ephemeral flowers. So if you've ever been in a woodland in DuPage County in early spring, and you see those very, very early flowering plants, things like shooting star, wild geranium, Virginia waterleaf, those are the types of plants that these rusty patch queens depend on. So there's clue number one. We know that they need very early spring ephemeral flowers. Once they start getting that nectar and start a colony, they start producing female workers. These are sterile females, and you can see those are more what we're used to looking for rusty patch with that very distinct coloration. Moving into summer, it's a little bit of a status quo. So no major changes. The queen continues to produce female workers. Those workers go out, collect nectar and pollen. But that is clue number two. We know that from early spring and even into the summer, they need a consistent supply of nectar flowers. That means that when one species or some species of those spring flowers die off, they require a new host of flowers, a new species of flowers to emerge at that point. And so in summer, as you well know, there's many different flowers available. Some of their preferred plants will be things like white and purple prairie clover, coneflower, and especially bergamot. So wild bergamot or bee balm or monarda is probably the number one resource for them, and frankly, many other bees and pollinators in summer. So again, we know that they need nectar plants in summer. In fall, that's when we start seeing major changes to the colony. So at that point, the queen starts producing not just the sterile workers, but reproductive males and reproductive females, which will become new queens. So these males and new queens are produced, they disperse away from the colony, they mate, and then at that point, the old queen dies off, all of the workers die off, all of the males die off. So the entire colony dies, and all you're left with are these new queens that have mated and are able next spring to create that next colony, that next generation. And so going into winter, all you're going to find is overwintering new queens. We don't know exactly where. We think they might overwinter in woodlands, under a wood pile or in an old rodent burrow, somewhere they can escape from predators and the cold. And that's all you have in winter. And then that next spring, the cycle will start again. But that also means in fall that they're still feeding and they still have energy requirements at this time. And so even now, as you look around in your local park or preserve or around your home, you'll see things in bloom like goldenrod or asters, gentian, native thistles. These are the types of plants that the bees would depend on in late fall and even up to very early winter. And then, as I mentioned, the new queens, one of the mysteries is exactly where they overwinter, but we're thinking they have some requirement of a nearby woodland. So where do you find them? When I talk about endangered species, oftentimes there's a preconception that you will only find them in the most remote, most pristine areas around, right? That you have to go completely off the beaten path, completely in the middle of nowhere to find them. And honestly, for some endangered species, that certainly is true. You really have to go out there to find them. But the great news about rusty patches, it's not the case for them. They are frequently found in parks, in preserves, even in home gardens. Really anywhere that has these nectar resources, these flowers, you can find foraging bees. You might not find the nest there necessarily, but you can frequently, relatively frequently, find the bees even in a very urbanized area. An example I give is I myself live in Winnebago County in Rockford, and the vast majority of observations in Rockford have come from home gardens, not necessarily preserves or other natural areas. And so it's just reassuring that this is an endangered species, absolutely, but is a species even in a densely urbanized area like DuPage County, and is something that we can see ourselves even in that urban area. So oftentimes people, after hearing this, are motivated to go and look for them, which I would absolutely encourage. It's a great thing to do. And so what do you do if you see something that you think is rusty patch bumblebee? Well, there are a few different ways that you can report those observations, and I would encourage you to do so if you think you've observed them. The map that I showed you earlier of their range depends on these types of observations, so they are critically important. So one of the first things I would recommend is anyone listening can sign up for a bee spotter account. So on beespotter.org, this is an organization run by the University of Illinois. It is completely free. It's a citizen science project, the goal of which is to get as many photos and observations of native bees in Illinois and throughout the Midwest as possible. So it's very easy how it works. You create an account, you go out, you take a photo of a bee, and not just rusty patch. We're interested in any native bumblebee that you might see. You take a photo of a bee, you upload that photo to Bee Spotter, you add in a little bit of information where you saw it, and then you try and identify it. And Bee Spotter has an amazing set of resources for identifying bees. So you take a shot at identifying it. And then the great news is that after you've done so, the Bee Spotter organization actually has U of I experts go and verify all of those observations to make sure the identification is correct. And then once it's verified, those observations are made public. So you can go on Bee Spotter, and if you're interested, you can search for a particular species and see when and where it was seen. And so the vast majority of observations are actually at this point coming from citizen science observations on Bee Spotter. You can also reach out to your local Illinois Department of Natural Resource office. If you're in DuPage County, I believe it is Region 3. Don't quote me on that, but I believe so. The main office is based out of James Pate Phillips State Park. But you can just do a quick search, see where your local office is. They'll have contact information. And so if you think you've seen the bee, you can contact DNR and let them know that you have a potential sighting. You can, of course, reach out to your local forest preserve district. And so again, if you're in DuPage County, that would eventually come to myself. And I'm always happy to look at photos of bees. If you've taken time to try and identify it, you think you have rusty patch, even if it wasn't necessarily on district property, I would be happy to try and identify that for you. And if it wasn't on district property, point you in the right direction of who might be the best person to report that to. So again, there are a number of ways if you're interested in trying to get more into bees and observing them, there's a number of ways that you can report these observations. So again, after that, people ask, well, how else can I help? And one of the great things about rusty patch bumblebee, unlike other endangered species, is there are a number of ways that you can help, even just as a homeowner or as a resident of DuPage County. There's a few different things you can do. So the first, and by far the most important that I would recommend, is wherever you have access to your home garden, maybe a natural area nearby a library, a school, plant native nectar plants. And so again, if you browse online, there are a number of lists available, and you can see one on the right side, and you don't have to read through it right now, but the US Fish and Wildlife Service and the Xerces Society are two lists that I use frequently. And they're very good because they show exactly what species are native to our area, to the Midwest and to Illinois. And you can see in that table to your right, it shows you at what times of year they bloom. And so that's a great way to get coverage throughout the year, right? So if you want to provide something to the bees in spring and in summer and in fall, you can reference these lists to understand what different plants you might want to have in your garden. And of course, the other way you can help all bees, and really many other pollinators as well, is avoiding the use of pesticides, particularly neonicotinoids. And I always try and tread carefully here in that I don't like telling people what they can and can't do on their own property, right? And I certainly recognize that sometimes the use of herbicides and pesticides is truly the most effective way to achieve whatever goal you're trying to achieve. And I recognize that and I can respect that. So what I would say is if you can avoid using those products altogether, try and do so. If you can't, make sure you're always following the label guidelines, the label amount, the label directions, so that you're applying those products in the right way, in the right amount, in the right location. But especially, even then, avoid using neonicotinoids. That is a class of pesticide that is extremely harmful to all pollinators. And we at the district, as an example of what we do, we will not use any product that we know contains a neonicotinoid. And even when we're purchasing plants or seeds from a nursery, we will ask if those plants or even if those seeds have been treated with a neonicotinoid, because that is a type of chemical that will last in the plant even from the seedling stage. It will still exist in the plant as the plant grows. And if that nursery cannot tell us if it has been treated with a neonicotinoid or not, we will not purchase those materials. And so that would be definitely one of my recommendations for really preserving and protecting and restoring many different pollinator populations. So moving on, let's take a look at our, yeah,
we did have one question about the rusty patch.
yeah, please.
Christine wanted to know, where do they lay their eggs?
So they grow in a colony. And so they will lay their eggs in the colony. And so, as I mentioned, if you recall with the queen, where we said we don't really know where the queen is overwintering, I would say the same thing with the rusty patch colonies. I believe some were recently discovered, but up until then, and I don't believe that's even been published yet, we haven't quite known where they create these colonies. Our thought, the best we know, is that they very likely will start a colony in, more often than not, like an old rodent burrow, something that's already been excavated underground, but is abandoned, usually on the edge of both a woodland and like a prairie where there's plenty of nectar resources. And that's where the queen is producing her eggs, is within that colony. Pretty much once she's in that colony and has it started, the queen doesn't ever really leave and will continue producing eggs throughout her lifetime right there in that old rodent burrow or wherever else they may have started that colony. Does that answer the question well? Okay.
We can assume so unless she asks another question.
Sounds good.
Thank you.
I'm sorry, I should have also mentioned too, please feel welcome to ask questions throughout the presentation, and please feel welcome to stop me at any time. I would love to answer them throughout, or if there's any left over at the end, I can answer them then as well.
And actually, we've got a new question. What is their range from their colony?
That is a great question. So most insects, many insects are really good flyers. And so I don't think it would be unheard of to find a rusty patched worker up to a mile away from their colony, certainly up to a half mile. That one I can say with a certainty. After a mile, I'm a little skeptical, but I would say up to a mile away from where their colony is, which frankly is one of the reasons why it's been so hard to track these colonies, because you might see a worker, but you have no idea where that colony is. It could be up to a mile away. And, there's been some debate about tracking these workers, putting like a little radio transmitter on them. None of that has come to fruition yet. But yeah, they can, as with many other insects like that, they can fly a significant distance away from their colony. So it's just one other factor leading to a little bit more difficulty in identifying where they are. Okay.
All right. Thank you.
Yeah, of course. So looking at our second species, and this is one that I worked very closely with, is the Hine's emerald dragonfly. You can see an excellent photo of it here. It is actually a fairly nondescript species. And so if you see it, unlike a lot of other dragonflies we have in the area, it doesn't have any markings on the wings. It doesn't really have too many markings on the body. You can see on the thorax, the part of the body where the wings are connected, it has some kind of pale green and cream colored stripes on it, but not much beyond that. However, in a mature adult, you get these very distinct bright green emerald eyes, which is of course where it gets its name from. And so once you see that, you see this kind of drab, brownish black dragonfly with these incredibly bright emerald eyes, there's a good chance you might be looking at a Hine's emerald dragonfly, though there are other emeralds that exist. So again, they are the only federally endangered dragonfly in the country. They were originally discovered in Ohio around 1900, and by the mid 1900s, it was thought that they were extinct. They were just not seen again. However, in 1988, they were rediscovered right here in Illinois in the Des Plaines River Valley. So one of the interesting and somewhat difficult things about Hines is that they're considered habitat specialists. So recall with Rusty Patch, I made a point of saying that you can find them anywhere and that they're not necessarily in these really out there locations. They're not, in some remote area. That is not the case with Hines emerald dragonfly. They are in very remote, very specific areas. And that's what we mean by habitat specialist is they, at some point in their life, require an extremely specific type of habitat, and that is the only place they will exist, and particularly the only place they will breed. And what we find is that it is the larval stage, the young, immature stage, where they are habitat specialists. So let's take a little bit of a look at the larvae, and you can see an image of one down there. They're, again, fairly nondescript as larvae. Sometimes people describe them as kind of spider-like. They have these splayed out legs, and they are aquatic. So all dragonflies actually start their lives in the water. They lay eggs in the water. Those eggs hatch, and their larval stage exists entirely in the water. They only emerge out of water as adults. The interesting thing about Hines is they actually exist in the larval stage in the water for about 4 to 5 years, which is incredibly long-lived for an insect species. It is one of the longest lived in the larval stage in water. And as you can imagine, that leads to some difficulties. If you are in the water, if you need to be in the water for 4 to 5 years, you're really exposing yourself to a number of factors that might harm you. If there's an impact to the water table, predation, a drought year, anything like that, you're really putting yourself at risk. So it's one of the difficulties they face. So they need to be in the water for 4 to 5 years, but the type of water they need is very specific. So I'll give you the list of what they require as larvae, and keep in mind, they need every single thing on this list. If even one thing is missing, they won't exist in that habitat. So first, they need seeps and springs. So the water in which they live has to be a groundwater source. It has to be a seep or a spring. It can't be surface water. That seep or spring, that groundwater has to emerge out of dolomite bedrock, which is a type of bedrock we have in the area. I'm not a geologist myself, but my understanding is it's fairly high in calcium. And so as the water passes through that dolomite, it takes on some of that calcium. Not entirely sure why that's a necessity for the dragonflies, but again, we only find them in those areas. When that water emerges in the surface, it needs to form a streamlet. So not a river, not a creek, not a stream, but a streamlet, which is a very narrow, very shallow, very slow flowing body of water, something usually not more than about a foot wide, a foot deep, and a very, very low rate of flow. And even if you have all of these, you still need one other habitat factor, which is devil crayfish. So that's the devil crayfish right there. They are a burrowing crayfish species, not necessarily rare. They're fairly common in our area. But these larvae will only live in the burrows of devil crayfish. And frankly, it's for reasons we don't really understand. When I tell people this, oftentimes the thought is that, okay, if the dragonfly larvae will only live in the burrows of devil crayfish, no other species of crayfish, only devil crayfish, there needs to be some mutualistic commensal relationship, right? They're both benefiting somehow. But we find that's not really the case. The crayfish are voracious predators of the dragonfly larvae. If a crayfish detects a larvae in its burrow, it will eat that larvae. So we don't really understand why the dragonflies would choose to select living in a burrow of something that's likely to eat them. But some of the thoughts are that these crayfish burrows are incredibly deep. I've put my arm in them many times before. I've been up to my shoulder and still not touched the bottom of them. They can go 6 to 10 feet underground into the water table. And so by being that deep, the dragonflies in that burrow can escape freezing temperatures in winter. So even though the surface water might be frozen, they're so far underground in the water table that they don't experience those freezing temperatures. Or also, even though that the crayfish will eat the dragonflies, by being in this burrow, they do escape many other predators. They're not exposed to fish, they're not exposed to birds, so they can escape many other predators, though they are at risk of this one in particular. So if you have all of those habitat factors and the larvae manages to live 5 years, 4 to 5 years, at that point you'll get the adults. And the adults only live about 3 to 6 weeks. And it sounds short, and it is, but that's pretty common for insects. Usually when we see a long-lived insect species, it's in the larval stage that they spend most of their time. You know, the 17-year cicadas being a great example, where they spend 17 years as larvae underground, and then as adults might only last a couple of weeks or so. Hines are the same way. Basically, they only exist as adults to breed, to, create those fertilized eggs, lay those eggs in the streamlets, and then that's it for the adults. And you'll usually find the adults nearby the breeding habitat, particularly the males. They don't feed very much. They really spend almost all of their adult life trying to mate. The females, going back to what we said about Rusty Patch flying far away, the females are extremely strong flyers. They can fly, 5 miles or more away from their breeding site. But then eventually they'll come back to be able to breed with one of those hovering males. So where is Hine's emerald dragonfly currently? Well, as of right now, we know of 4 population centers, which the species only exists in the United States. So this is the worldwide population. So they exist in Missouri, in the southeast corner of the state, in Illinois, particularly northeast Illinois in the Des Plaines River Valley, in Wisconsin, mostly in Door County, and then in Michigan, in both the upper and lower peninsulas. So of those 4 population centers, we use Door County as an example of one that is doing okay. It is stable. So in Door County, the average annual population is about 3,000 adult hinds every year. So for an insect, that's still pretty low, but it's considered stable. In comparison, the Illinois population in the entire state of Illinois only averages about 200 adult hinds every year. And so that is critically endangered. That is on the brink of being extirpated from the state. All it's going to take is one bad year, one drought, one flood, and they could be removed from the state forever. So when you have a species, when you have a population that is that critically endangered, you need to step in. And so when you're protecting an endangered species, often what you do first is protect their habitat. And in some cases, that might be enough to preserve their population. But in the case of hinds, particularly in Illinois, simply protecting their habitat is not enough. And so you can step in a number of different ways. One is that you can not just protect, but restore their habitat. Going back to areas where they exist but are severely degraded, you can restore those areas and try and make them better, try and make them what they used to be. You can also create habitat, right? And so, if you want to create habitat for monarchs, you plant milkweed where there was no milkweed before. Certainly with Hines being habitat specialists and remembering what they need, it is much more difficult to create brand new habitat, but there are some ways to do so. But even then, in the most extreme examples, that's still not enough. And what you would have to do at that point is remove the animals from the wild, bring them into a controlled setting, try.
Hey, Andres. Um,
We may have lost him, or at least the sound. I'm gonna.
It doesn't seem like he's hearing us.
Andres, we can't actually hear you anymore. I'm not sure why, because you're not muted, and I don't think you can hear us.
Andres? Now he froze.
Let's see.
No. We can't hear you. Can't hear you. Can't hear.
And he might have spotlighted himself, so he can't. He doesn't realize we've lost.
He knows now that we're not hearing. He could tell. Okay. That's weird.
That is strange because he's not muted.
And he was
Oh, can we hear you now, Andres?
There we go. There we go. Better?
Better.
Did I lose you at a previous slide or at this one?
I think go back to the slide before. I actually was looking at the participation. I think towards the you were starting to talk about habitat restoration on this slide.
Okay, yep. So thank you. And thank you, Marion, for pointing that out. I appreciate that very much. So as I was saying, when a species is critically endangered like that, there are different ways to step in. Habitat restoration, habitat creation, and I mentioned that, with something like Hines, that can be incredibly difficult to do considering what they require as larvae. It's not easy to necessarily create habitat, but it is possible. But even then, you might need to step in further, and you might need to actually remove those animals from the wild and bring them in an indoor setting, raise them with greater than natural survivorship, and then release them back out into the wild. And we would call that a captive rearing program. And so on this slide, we were taking a quick look at those three aspects of how to help such a critically endangered species, one being habitat restoration. So in this polygon, you can see this is the natural area in a district property where Hines had existed historically and still do. And you can see in that polygon, it's heavily wooded. It wasn't always like that. It used to be a marshy, grassy area. The marsh is where they could breed, and that grassy upland is where they could forage for food. But around the turn of the century, it was cleared for mining, actually mining limestone. And then it was let go. And then it was turned into a farm. And then it was let go. And over the years, you can see it was completely filled with these woody invasive species. So over many years, we've worked very hard to clear that area. This is what it looks like now. And you can see we've restored that area to what it used to be, which is, again, a cattail marsh and a grassy upland area. Habitat creation is certainly not easy, but it is possible. So as I just mentioned, that area previously was mined around the turn of the century. When it was mined, the mining company actually drilled a number of artesian wells in the area to be able to to provide water to the workers as well as to the draft animals. And so those artesian wells still existed. They weren't in good condition, but we were able to repair them. And so now we had a source of groundwater that we could control. And so we repaired those wells. And we added essentially a valve to them so we could adjust the flow and turn them on and off as we wanted. It's a little difficult to see in this photo to the right, but you can see this is a pool where that water daylights, where it comes to the surface. And then it flows off into the cattail marsh, and we can adjust the flow so that it forms a streamlet. And so certainly it's not an easy thing to do. And frankly, it can't be done everywhere you might want to create habitat, but in some areas you can actually create more habitat. But even then, as we found with Hines, it's just not enough. And we've had to step in with a captive rearing program. And you can see us there holding one of those reared dragonflies in an indoor setting. So captive rearing, it's something that I work very closely with and is one of, frankly, the most interesting projects I work on. So how it works is actually very, very unique. So when you want to raise something indoors, when you want to take it out of the wild and bring it indoors, the first thing you need is, of course, a stock of animals, right? You need to be able to bring the animals in. So the most efficient way to do this for Hines to get a large number of animals is to actually capture the females. And you can see that hand in that photo is holding a female dragonfly. And most dragonflies are very instinctual in that when you touch their abdomen, the tip of what might look like a tail, into water, it triggers them into thinking, now it's time to lay eggs. So you can actually hold that dragonfly, dip it into the water, and as soon as it touches the water, it starts laying eggs right there in that cup. And so it's an easy way to collect relatively a large number of eggs. And the reason I point this out and the reason why we do this in a natural setting, if we left those eggs completely where they were, just let them be in their habitat, Hines have less than 1% survivorship. So if you left those eggs out there, of every 100 eggs, you might get one breeding adult out of those 100 eggs. So if we can bring those 100 eggs in and raise them even with 20, 30, 40% survivorship, now we have 20, 30, or 40 dragonflies, whereas previously we only had one. And so really it's a way to potentially boost that population. So we collect those eggs and then we bring them indoors. And at the district, we have an aquatic research facility. It's called the Urban Stream Research Center in Blackwell Forest Preserve. And it's a state-of-the-art aquatic research facility. Primarily, we raise freshwater mussels, but it made sense for us to be able to utilize those systems to raise dragonflies. And what you're looking at there in that net is essentially like a 16-foot aquarium. And then attached to that, all of these pipes and other structures are everything you could want to control that water, to control the flow, how hot it is, how cold it is, how filtered the water is. And so we can provide the best conditions possible without without exposing them to predators, giving them as much food as they want, controlling the environment, raising them for those, 4 years in optimal conditions, and then releasing them back out into the wild. And you can see in that final photo, you see those pools on the ground. Those are just like little plastic kiddie pools. And then it has these mesh nets hanging above them. In each of those nets is one dragonfly larva. When they are ready to become adults, those larvae will crawl up that mesh netting, hatch out of their larval skin. They'll become adults at that point. You let them dry off for about a day, and then you can release them back out into the wild. And so it is, frankly, a very labor-intensive project, but so far it is the best way that we know of to really boost the population. And so I don't know if this will work. Let me turn down the volume in case it does. So these are the dragonfly larvae at Blackwell. You can see each of these cups has one dragonfly larvae in it. And if it works, this is just a very brief video of them feeding. I think it's a very interesting thing to look at. They have a unique mouth part. It's a silly analogy, but if you remember the movie Alien, how it has a mouth that actually shoots out, all dragonfly larvae have something similar. So if you look first at the one on the left and then at the one on the right, you should be able to see them catch some prey in a split second. Yeah, Doesn't look like it'll work. Hopefully, when I provide the link to the presentation, you might be able to see it on your computer and see them feed. But again, it's one of the most interesting things that I like looking at when I'm assisting with them. So moving forward, we do have some other project goals as it relates to Hines. And as I'm sure you can see right there, that is not a Hines emerald dragonfly. That is in fact a crayfish. So again, going back to an analogy with monarch butterflies. If you want to help monarch butterflies, you know that they require milkweed as larvae, and as adults they require other aspects, but as caterpillars they need milkweed. And so if you want to help monarchs, one of the things you need to do is plant milkweed, right? As silly as it might sound, if you want to help Hines emerald dragonflies, you have to plant crayfish. And what I mean by that is if you have an area where there are not Hines, or where there are, but there's not very many, you want to increase the carrying capacity of that habitat. That means you need to increase the number of crayfish burrows. And so what we've done is create a sister program where we are collecting devil crayfish from the wild, bringing them in lab, raising them in greater numbers, and then we can release these crayfish in areas where we want to eventually benefit Hines emerald dragonfly. And so that's what you see in these photos. So I should say first, the process starts with myself or another ecologist sticking our arm in a devil crayfish burrow. And basically you're noodling for them. You can't see in the burrow. You can't really wear a glove. You have to be able to feel very fine with your fingertips. And so you find a crayfish burrow and you just stick your arm in and you feel around, hoping to grab an adult crayfish. And you can see we got one there. But specifically what we would be looking for is one that is gravid, that has eggs on its abdomen. If we find one, we take them in the lab. We raise those eggs until they become these very small juvenile crayfish, almost look like little shrimp clinging on to mom. We can then take those juveniles and raise them up for 1 or 2 years. And all of a sudden, we have a larger stock of crayfish that we can release into areas that we want to benefit Hines. And so it's kind of a difficult thing to wrap your head around why we'd be raising crayfish for the dragonflies. But it is same as milkweed for monarchs, it's crayfish for dragonflies. And so in 2021 and 2022, we've been developing this project, figuring out better ways to get the crayfish, raise them in lab, and how to release them so that they create burrows that benefit the dragonflies. In addition to that, we want to spread the message about Hines and crayfish. And so we're working with a teacher. That teacher right there on the right-hand side is Paul Ritter. He's a teacher at Pontiac High School in Pontiac, Illinois. And he was actually the guy that created Operation Endangered Species. It was a program partnering with DNR to bring alligator snapping turtles into classrooms to not only get assistance in raising these turtles, right? So each classroom would get a turtle and the kids would help raise it. So it's not only helping the turtles, but it's helping spread the message. It's helping educate students. It's helping them really get hands-on with nature, with natural resources. And so we're looking to see if we can transition that and do something similar, something like crayfish in the classroom. Unfortunately, we can't do it with the dragonflies themselves. When you have a federally endangered species, there are a lot of restrictions on who can handle them and where they can be. But we can potentially get those crayfish in the classroom. And so that is another project goal of ours, to see if we can get students helping raise these crayfish, free up some of my time, of course, but also help educate them and really get that next generation of scientists getting their hands on something real. And so what I'd like to end off is answering the question of what you can do, and not just for these two species, but in general as a conservationist. So one thing I would strongly recommend, and a question I frequently get asked, especially for Hines, is why save one species? And I would encourage everyone listening to try and figure out how you would answer that question. if someone were to ask you, why is it so important to save one dragonfly species or one bumblebee species, think about how you would answer that question. And in doing so, you can become an advocate for not just those species again, but conservation in general. And also you can volunteer. There are many different citizen science projects out there. There's dragonfly monitoring, butterfly monitoring, firefly monitoring. There's so many different projects out there. And I always say there's only one of me. I can only do so much. But if we get these observations, if we get this volunteer assistance, it is incredibly valuable to saving these species, to helping restore these species. And this can be done at all different levels of comfort and accessibility. Whether you're someone that loves hiking off trail or whether you're someone that wants to kind of stay in your own yard, there are projects you can join that are very beneficial that would fit your needs. And so I would encourage you to look into those as well. And that's all I have for this presentation. I would like to say again, thank you to Wendy, Laura, and Joe for the invitation. It looks like some questions might have rolled in, and so I'd be happy to answer any questions at this time. Thank you again.
Thank you. Yeah, we do have some questions. So the first one is, and it was for the dragonfly, what do they feed on?
So the dragonflies are, thankfully, as much as I talk about them being specialists, as predators, they are generalists. And so the rule of thumb is if they can catch it, they'll eat it. What that really means is they are exclusively predatory. They only eat live animals, and it'll be anything smaller than their head. So other insects, other invertebrates in the water, even other dragonflies, if they're small enough, are things that they'll eat.
Okay. And then the next question is, when you release the Hines emerald, is it in Blackwell? Is there dolomite there so that they can continue to propagate?
No, it's not in Blackwell. So in DuPage County, it is in the southeast corner of the county, in and near Waterfall Glen. But some of them are also transported just slightly outside of the county, so into Will County. Lockport Prairie tends to be one of the best preserves for them. And, honestly, there's no harm in releasing them at Waterfall or at Lockport because they are such strong flyers that once you release them, they're going to go where they want to go. So they can easily disperse up and down the Des Plaines River Valley. But in terms of our releases, yeah, mostly Waterfall Glen and then in Will County.
Okay, and then there was a follow-up question to what do they eat? And did maybe clarifying is what do the larvae eat?
Yeah, so the larvae again will eat any aquatic insect or invertebrate that they can physically catch. So more specifically, aquatic isopods, amphipods, which are small crustaceans. They'll eat zooplankton, again, mostly are small crustaceans. They'll eat insects, they'll eat mosquitoes, they'll eat midge larvae, anything in the water small enough for them to get. And when I say small enough too, the dragonfly larvae at full size are only about an inch long. So anything smaller than that is a potential prey item for them in the water. As adults, kind of the same thing. Whatever they can catch, flying mosquitoes, damselflies, sometimes even butterflies, things like that. If they can catch it, they'll eat it.
Okay, this is just in general, how do we contact the forest preserve if we're interested in helping a species?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I would recommend, at least in DuPage County for the Forest Preserve District, if you go to dupageforest.org, which is just the main district webpage, you'll see a number of links right there on the front of the webpage, including if you want to volunteer, there's a link for volunteering, and then we can describe all the different volunteering programs. If you're interested in donating, we have a nonprofit organization, the Friends of the Forest Preserve. So there's a way to donate. But I would say whatever your interest might be, however you would like to contribute, just go on dupageforest.org and you can start going down that road and immediately get in contact with people who can answer your questions.
And the next question was, how do you move the bumblebee colonies?
So we don't move them. So the way it works is, say this year there's a colony in X location or X preserve. That colony will keep going. As I mentioned, they die off in winter. Those new queens overwinter. When those new queens wake up in spring, they will usually not reuse that colony. They will fly somewhere else and start a new colony somewhere else. Where they decide to do so and how they make that decision, I'm not entirely certain. I don't know if anyone has that information. But that's how the colonies move, is when those new queens in spring fly around looking for an area to start a new colony. That's how you find new colonies in different locations.
All right, thank you. And there's one more question so far about how many dragonflies do you release each year?
It's a great question. Unfortunately, it's not on a set schedule. At any given year, this year, as an example, I have some dragonflies that are going to be ready to emerge next year. And so if we're just looking at what we have at USRC, it would be maybe about 8 in our facility. And I say that because there are other organizations that are doing a similar captive rearing project. So it certainly won't just be 8 for the entire year in 2022. That's just at our facility. Then we have others that probably need about 1 more year. And then we have others that probably need about 4 more years to grow. So it's always kind of this mix of growth rates, mix of individuals. On average, we've been running this program since 2016, and since then, about 150 dragonflies have been released in Illinois. So just as a rough number, that's about what we're looking at.
All right, any more questions? Okay, I am going to stop the recording, but if